The storm clouds gathered slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A trade skirmish here, a veiled threat there, but those of us paying attention knew it was more than just a passing squall. This was the prelude to a full-blown economic hurricane, a collision between the world's two titans, the United States and China. And at the eye of this storm, Donald Trump, a man who never shied away from a fight, especially when he believed America was being taken advantage of. Trump, ever the showman, had declared that if China wanted a fight, America was ready. The words, amplified by social media and cable news, reverberated across the globe, rattling markets from Tokyo to Frankfurt. It was a declaration of economic war, and the opening salvo was a proposed 100% tariff on a vast array of Chinese imports, electronics, solar panels, electric vehicles, even medical devices, all in the crosshairs. The stated reason? China's tightening grip on rare earth mineral exports, a chokehold on the raw materials vital to modern technology. But the truth ran deeper. This was about power, about reclaiming America's technological dominance, about redrawing the map of global production. Beijing, predictably, didn't take kindly to the threat. The Ministry of Commerce issued a stern warning, promising countermeasures to defend national interests and safeguard global supply chains. The counterpunch when it came was swift and strategic. Forget tit-for-tat tariffs on consumer goods. China went for the jugular, targeting the very foundation of America's technological prowess: rare earth minerals. Lithium, neodymium, praseodymium, these aren't household names, but they are the lifeblood of the digital age. Semiconductors, electric vehicle batteries, advanced electronics all depend on these materials, and China controls nearly 90% of their global processing. It was a weapon of immense power, one that Beijing had been hesitant to wield, but now, under the pressure of Trump's escalating tariffs, they were ready to unsheath it. The Financial Times called it a geopolitical weapon, and they weren't wrong. Without Chinese minerals, factories powering giants like Tesla, Apple, Intel, and Samsung could grind to a halt. The implications in Washington were immediately clear. A disruption of rare earth supplies could cripple America's tech ecosystem. Bloomberg Economics reported that the Trump administration was already scrambling to offer financial incentives to lure manufacturers out of China and into countries like India, Vietnam, and Mexico. It was a strategy of economic encirclement aimed at weakening Beijing's industrial reach and restoring U.S. dominance. But from China's perspective, it was nothing short of economic aggression, a deliberate attempt to destabilize its economy. Think tanks linked to the Chinese government reportedly presented Xi Jinping with three potential response strategies: selling off U.S. Treasury bonds, China held over $770 billion, 0 cents, restricting exports of high-tech components used in American defense and space industries, and ramping up military activity in the South China Sea, including live exercises near Taiwan and Guam. The Rand Corporation warned that China appeared ready to combine economic, military, and diplomatic pressure in a coordinated effort to alter the global balance of power. The Pentagon responded by increasing surveillance operations and deploying additional naval vessels to the Sea of Japan, signaling a dangerous escalation. The world held its breath, wondering if this was the beginning of a new Cold War, one fought not with missiles and tanks, but with tariffs and rare earth minerals. A leaked report from the Department of Energy painted a grim picture. America's rare earth metal reserves could sustain the semiconductor industry for a mere 7 months if Chinese supplies were cut off. 7 months, that's all that stood between technological supremacy and a screeching halt. Zeiming, in a closed-door meeting, reportedly declared that if others tried to choke China's economy, China would show it could choke them with technology. The message was clear. This wasn't just about trade, it was about survival. Washington responded with a $400 billion 0 cents national program aimed at securing America's technological independence. Them semiconductor plants in Arizona and Ohio, expanded rare metal mining in Nevada, a national lithium reserve, ambitious plans, but years away from fruition. The confrontation was happening now. Across the Atlantic, panic gripped European capitals. Germany, the industrial heartland of Europe, faced a potential collapse of its auto industry. German manufacturers, heavily reliant on Chinese materials for electric vehicles, braced for a deep recession. The head of the German Automobile Manufacturers Association warned that without Chinese lithium and magnesium, Europe's industrial machine would stall. Inside China, a massive economic restructuring was underway. Made in China for China became the new mantra, a pivot towards self-sufficiency and domestic innovation. The government allocated $1 trillion to boost national microelectronics firms and construct new rare metal refining facilities. China was preparing for a world where cooperation with the West could no longer be taken for granted. But the United States wasn't out of options. The Trump administration considered a sweeping ban on all exports to China involving dual-use technologies, tools that could serve both civilian and military purposes, artificial intelligence, quantum processors, advanced simulation software, all on the chopping block. A White House task force was created to study the feasibility of a complete technological embargo, an action compared to the global shock of the 1970s oil crisis. The stakes were rising exponentially. Economic experts warned of an emerging dual-world economy, two rival blocs, one centered around Washington, the other around Beijing, locked in a battle for dominance. Globalization as we knew it was fracturing. Multinational corporations began building separate supply chains, one for the American market, another for China. Efficiency plummeted, costs soared, and the world economy splintered into factions. The question became one of endurance. Which nation could withstand the strain longer? China's growth had already slowed, squeezed by shrinking exports and weakening investment. But Beijing was working to insulate itself, forging alliances beyond Washington's reach. Ties with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and other BRICS members deepened, creating alternative trade routes and payment networks. More than 30 nations were preparing to use the yuan and ruble for oil and gas transactions, effectively bypassing the US dollar. A direct challenge to American economic supremacy. Ironically, despite the escalating rhetoric and sanctions, trade between the two powers continued. Cargo ships still crossed the Pacific, contracts were still signed, business conferences still took place, as though nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, a deep mistrust festered. Each new tariff, each new export control widened the divide, fueling uncertainty and suspicion. An uneasy calm with an undertone of something familiar, a chill that echoed the atmosphere of the Cold War. The world appeared to be entering a new era, defined by confrontation, not cooperation. Geopolitics, technology, and resources had fused into a single struggle for dominance, and neither side seemed willing to yield. Every factory, trade deal, and policy decision had become part of a much larger contest, shaping the century ahead. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before reporters on Thursday, measured and calm as questions swirled around Canada's growing tensions with Beijing. He confirmed plans to meet with senior Chinese leaders soon, but sidestepped speculation about a potential deal that could see Ottawa lift tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for relief on canola exports. Carney made it clear that Canada's engagement with China was resuming after years of frosty relations, but the scope of those talks, he hinted, was far broader than a trade of tariffs. Canadian officials later confirmed that Carney could meet Chinese President Xi Jinping during two upcoming summits in Asia, a meeting that would mark a new phase in what both sides hope will be a managed, if fragile, reset. At the press conference, Carney stressed that any progress would take time and that the bilateral relationship had to be viewed through a wider lens than individual industries or commodities. It's naive to narrow such a complex partnership to a single trade-off, he explained, signaling that the talks would address not only trade but also political and security dimensions shaping the region. The tension between Ottawa and Beijing had been building for months. China's decision to impose anti-dumping duties on Canadian canola imports followed Canada's earlier move to apply 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, a symbolic show of alignment with Washington's broader effort to curb Chinese industrial expansion. China's ambassador to Canada had floated a possible compromise: remove the tariffs on vehicles and Beijing would drop its duties on canola, but Coy avoided endorsing that proposal. He emphasized that any move by Canada would also have to account for how the United States, currently locked in its own escalating trade war with China, might respond. The situation, he implied, was far more delicate than a simple exchange of concessions. While Carney's diplomatic balancing act unfolded, another front in Canada's trade challenges was heating up in Washington. High-level negotiations were taking place between Canadian and American officials as both sides sought to ease mounting tensions over steel, aluminum, and energy. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, joined by Privy Council clerk Michael Sabia and senior negotiators, spent the week in the U.S. Capitol meeting with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. The Canadian delegation's goal was to secure sector-specific agreements that could stabilize key industries shaken by tariffs and uncertainty. LeBlanc described the conversations as productive and said both sides recognized the urgency of finding common ground. The talks were continuing against a backdrop of rising pressure at home, where several provincial leaders were demanding that Ottawa push back harder against the Trump administration's economic maneuvers. During Carney's visit to Washington the week before, Trump had instructed his top trade officials to keep negotiating with their Canadian counterparts to reach quick deals that could ease strain on both economies. McCoy told reporters that if progress could be achieved on steel, aluminum, and energy, the focus could then shift to broader areas of cooperation. But the trade war's effects were already taking a toll on the auto sector. Trump's decision to impose a 25% tariff on cars and light trucks built outside the United States was designed to force automakers to bring production back to American soil. Within weeks, the impact rippled across North America. Stellantis, the parent company of Chrysler, announced a massive $13 billion zero-cents investment to expand its U.S. operations, creating thousands of new jobs in Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. Part of that expansion included moving Jeep Compass production from the Edmonton assembly plant in Ontario to Illinois, a move that stunned Canadian officials who had recently offered Stellantis generous subsidies and incentives worth up to $15 billion zero cents to maintain and grow its presence in Canada. Industry Minister Melanie Joly called the decision unacceptable. Speaking in New Brunswick, she criticized the company for pulling back on commitments made under agreements with both the federal and Ontario governments. She reminded reporters that public funds had supported the retooling of Edmonton's facility and vowed to hold Stellantis accountable. Carney echoed those concerns, linking the company's decision directly to U.S. trade policies. He said his government would work with Stellantis to find alternative opportunities for the affected workers and ensure the company honored its pledges. The global chessboard had become a complex web of interconnected moves, and Canada, caught in the middle, was struggling to maintain its footing. The problem with economic warfare, as with any kind of warfare, is that there are no clean victories. Everyone bleeds, some more than others. And while politicians in Washington and Beijing postured and threatened, the real casualties were the workers, the farmers, the small business owners caught in the crossfire. The promise of a revitalized American industrial base, of a China forced to play by the rules, rang hollow when factories closed, jobs disappeared, and prices soared. The dream of a new world order, whether led by the US or China, seemed destined to be built on the backs of those who could least afford it. The question wasn't just who would win, but what would be left when the dust finally settled.